Welcome to episode number 68 of 100 Plus, an overview of 100 of the most important people, events, and ideas of the last 2,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, Western civilization, the Christian faith, and you. This series of lectures is based on the idea that if we back up to the intersection of the Greeks and Romans with the Jews and Christians, and then trace their development as it unfolds through the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, modernity, and postmodernity, we will not only gain a better understanding of the past and greater clarity about the present, we will also learn how to follow Christ more thoughtfully and faithfully today. In this lecture, we focus on the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. I spent my first year in seminary asking lots of people to define lots of terms. What exactly is neo-orthodoxy? What does post-exilic mean? Can someone explain existentialism to me? What, in the name of all that is holy, does hyper-superlapsarianism mean? And should I really care? Learning new words is to be expected. In every field, there is a vocabulary you have to master to join the conversation. We don't want our doctor saying, that little doohickey thing in the back of your throat looks red. Or a mechanic saying, the small shiny part that connects to the oily spinning thing needs to be replaced. As Twain noted, sometimes the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and lightning bug. Well, one of the terms that was being thrown around with some frequency back in the mid-'80s was dialectical materialism. It sounded very ominous. And I remember it now because I remember asking at least 3 different people to explain it to me, and I didn't get it. It comes up now because it brings us back to Hegel. We are looking at Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Wilhelm to his friends, and GWF Hegel in print. He was a very significant late 18th and early 19th century German philosopher. Now, I realize that to some of you, the thought of learning about a German philosopher sounds doubly boring. Philosophy in and of itself is a whole lot to do about nothing. German philosophy, that sounds like, it sounds like long, boring words that we do not know and cannot pronounce, and it is even more boring. Look, I think you're mistaken. Yes, there are writers and teachers who make philosophy boring, and yes, Hegel can be uniquely hard to read, but his ideas matter. If you look him up, you find out that he is one of the key influences behind Marx and Marxism. You'll find him listed in the pantheon of the founders of Western philosophy. He's someone who's important enough that his thoughts are cited on all kinds of topics. You'll see Hegel referenced in works on art and history and ontology and politics. He's important enough that his name gets turned into both an ism, so we will talk about Hegelianism, and also into an adjective, as in your argument has Hegelian overtones to it. You'll also find him praised by a wide variety of people. So Paul Tillich, and by the way, it's Tillich, not Tillich. I heard one of the podcasts I listened to last week, the presenter kept saying Tillich, and so no, it's Tillich. Tillich is not somebody we're actually going to talk about. He is an important 20th century theologian, liberal theologian. The first theology class I had at Trinity was taught by Dr. Kenneth Conser, and Conser, it was his last year before he retired. He was a very thoughtful, godly, soft-spoken guy, and he made this comment about Tillich. He cited Tillich on something, and then he said, I'm sure you're surprised that I'm citing Tillich, but even a stopped clock is right twice a day. And then he was all over himself apologizing. He shouldn't have made such disparaging remarks about Dr. Tillich. I actually thought it was funny, but Kantzer noted that at the end of his life, Tillich regretted that he had written a Christian systematic theology because he felt like that was not the way things were going, that all the religions were going to merge together. He should have written a sort of a world religions systematic theology. So he's not somebody that had what I would think of as an orthodox Christian faith. And we're not going to say a lot about him in the future, but he's an important guy. And about Hegel, Tillich said, he has influenced world history more profoundly than any other structural analysis. Tillich was not alone in that. Karl Barth, and here I will just say, since I just said it's not Tillich, it's Tillich, I'll say it's not Barth, it's Barth. We got to get these German pronunciations right. Karl Barth was the founder, in one sense, of neo-orthodoxy, and he will come up. I think he is an important person to understand, but he described Hegel as, quote, the Protestant Aquinas. So that is high praise, if you'll remember how prominently Roman Catholics think of St. Thomas Aquinas. And there are others. Not everybody's a fan of Hegel's, to be sure. And a lot of people, Kierkegaard and even Marx, will disagree with him strongly on some issues. But the fact is he's so important that pretty much everybody has to comment on him. So suffice it to say that while philosophers are not as famous as politicians, athletes, actors, business leaders, just about anybody, maybe they're more famous than pastors, but philosophers are very influential. Philosophers like Hegel changed societies for generations to come. So this is lecture number 68. We are moving through the 19th century. As was just noted in the last episode. In the U.S., this means it's the era of the Civil War, westward expansion, the Second Great Awakening, assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It's also a time of the growth of confidence in human reason. The heady academic angle of knowing, which has been nurtured by the scholastics, taken some baby steps during the Renaissance, and then really sort of comes into its own with both the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. This default to human reason and the rational is going to continue to pick up steam. So reason is increasingly elevated as the way that we know what we know. It's celebrated as the source of authority. So you'll remember a couple times I've commented on the sources of authority and this whole quadrilateral: reason, revelation, tradition, and experience. At the moment, reason is pushing all of the other epistemological tools aside. And what we will see as reason sort of carries the day, and as we move into the middle to late 19th century, move into what we call the modern era, there's going to be a real heady optimism spread. There will be a growing belief, especially among the elites, that with enough time and enough education, that humanity is going to be able to fix everything and usher in a utopia. Forget heaven in heaven. Heaven is coming to earth. In the 19th century, we don't need God. Man is large and in charge. And now that he's been freed from the suffocating dogma of small-minded faith, and now that direction is being fueled by science, there's this belief that progress is going to just spread quickly. Each generation is going to be better off than the one before, and all of this is just around the corner. So I bring this up because I bring this whole idea of progress up because Hegel is one of the ones whose thinking contributes to this. Charles Darwin will do more, in one sense, to sort of congeal all these different ideas of progress and evolution and other things. I mentioned last time his book, The Origin of Species, is going to provide the first plausible explanation for sort of godless Genesis event to just come about. So you've got Darwin, you've also got others, Julius Wellhausen with his argument that the Old Testament, that the Bible in general, but the Old Testament in particular, is just sort of an amalgamation of other human thinking and superstition and plagiarized insights. Karl Marx is going to come along, have his foot on the gas pedal. We're going to see all kinds of scientists and others making all kinds of impressive advances in medicine, engineering, aeronautics, and the like. And so what Hegel is going to do is provide a little bit of the architecture that all of these things hang on, that all of these disparate ideas and fields can build upon. So, who is Hegel? G.W.F. Hegel was born in Stuttgart in August of 1770. He is going to die in 1831. He was, as it seems like I've said this before about a number of these very impressive people, he was a very precocious child who started reading and learning other languages at a very young age. He ends up going, as a young man, he goes to the Protestant seminary at the University of Tübingen. There he's quite taken by the Greeks and by Rousseau, and he likes the French Revolution. He didn't think much about the Reign of Terror, but he's a real fan of the French Revolution. And I read that he drank a toast to the storming of the Bastille every July 14th. So I just have to say, especially since we just did Lincoln and Lincoln's assassination, saying you're all for the French Revolution, just that the Reign of Terror is this little footnote on it. It's sort of like the joke. But other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? Yeah, it's like there is this little thing. Your husband was assassinated. So other than the Reign of Terror, how did you like the French Revolution? After he graduated, he worked as a tutor for a couple different aristocratic families in Berlin, I've got Bern, so maybe it's just Bern. And he starts writing books. So he wrote a book on the life of Jesus entitled The Positivity of the Christian Religion, which I'll just say sounds very much, I haven't read it, sounds very much like the kind of less than orthodox, sort of liberal thinking that you get in the 18th century. He wrote on Fragments of Religion and Love, The Spirit of Christianity and Its Fate, and then this sounds like a real page-turner, The Oldest Systematic Program of German Idealism. I'm sure you're going to rush right out and buy that. So, 1801, Hegel joins the faculty. Now, he's not actually paid for this job, but he gets the title. He joins the faculty at a university in Germany. He got his job based on his dissertation that critiqued the idea that there was a planet between Mars and Jupiter. So you have to remember that for a good while, science is really considered sort of natural philosophy. And so you have a lot of these philosophers who actually are thinking about math and physics and those kinds of things. So many of these people are studying math. Today, I would not expect a philosopher to have the ability to sort of do the math calculations on, gravitational pull and planetary orbits. But he writes a dissertation on that. He gets hired. And then he publishes a second book pretty quickly after that on logic and metaphysics. And then he's also going to start a journal on philosophy. And so he's going to start lecturing in different fields at this point. By the way, metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that deals with all the really heady things like being and knowing and substance and time. I think of metaphysics as a topic that is almost always going to give me a headache and leave me feeling stupid. That perhaps is just me. Hegel apparently couldn't get enough of it, which, by the way, is why you find, if you read him, you find sentences in which he is trying to explain how the indeterminate immediate is free from determinatedness in relation to essence. I I know what each one of these words means, but I have no idea what that sentence means. So I have heard that once you crack the code on reading Hegel, ideally in German, that he's not that hard to understand. His ideas are relatively simple, as opposed to, say, Plato, who's relatively easy to read, but his ideas are more complicated. But anyway, he's going to start to lecture on these kinds of fields. So by now, you should have picked up that he's a really, really bright boy. You might have also picked up that he needs a job, because he's actually had 2 professorships in which he didn't get paid. So at this moment, he publishes one of the books he's the most famous for. It was what people were waiting for, the Phenomenology of Spirit, sort of his breakthrough book. However, tragically, on the day that it comes out, Hegel, and he writes about this in his journal, Hegel watches Napoleon come into town. He's in Jena in Germany. He watches Napoleon come into Jena, sort of doing some reconnaissance, and in a matter of days, the city falls, and because it falls, the university suffers, and so Hegel ends up losing his job, and he bounces around from job to job for a while. He fathers an illegitimate child. Not long after that, things will begin to turn around. He will marry, have a few children, accept a position at the University of Heidelberg. He will adopt the son, the son that he had fathered out of wedlock, who had been living in an orphanage. He'll write a few more books. He'll become increasingly famous. He will eventually accept the chair of philosophy at the University of Berlin, which was the chair of philosophy in the world at the time. And from that point on, he will write more books. His lectures will become very famous. His lecture notes will get published, and his fame continues to spread. He doesn't live much longer than this, begins to have some health problems, and in 1831 dies during a cholera epidemic. His last words, and you can appreciate this if you go back to the sentence, the indeterminate immediate is free from the determinatedness in relation to essence. His last words were, "Nobody understood me." He says, actually, there's only one man that ever understood me, but he didn't understand me. So I don't even think you can get that statement clear. Okay, so in common English, what were Hegel's big ideas? Why should we care about this guy? As I noted, he becomes quite famous, and his name becomes an adjective and an ism. Why is he so important? So I'm going to say the big ideas that I'm particularly interested in are around the field of, around the thinking around progress. But let me put 5 other observations or ideas of Hegel in the honorable mention category. Number 1, against the thinking of the day, Hegel argued that history was important. At the time that he was writing, people considered history to be primitive. There was, to cite C.S. Lewis, a lot of chronological snobbery. Maybe that's G.K. Chesterton. But anyway, there's a lot of chronological snobbery going around. People who thought they were better, smarter, just altogether at another level than the people who lived before them. The view of the educated was that they needed to look forward, not to look back. So Hegel had this idea that every era had insights and that we needed to look backwards to figure out what the insights were of that era, because not all of those insights would carry forward. So we could go back and learn things about, say, honor by studying the Romans. And if we don't do these things, we're going to lose them. Because he'll argue, and I'll explain this a little bit more detail later, that history lurches about. Societies lurch up and down and backwards, and there's progress, but it's not pretty, and it's not always linear. So he thinks that the past can help us because we might have blind spots in the present. And I like that thinking. However, just so you understand, Hegel, who does not have anything approaching an orthodox understanding of Christian faith, he is going to, in some ways, sort of make a claim to the Christian faith, He's going to believe that God becomes man, but he's going to argue that that's not in the incarnation of Jesus, that God becomes man because God is spirit and the human mind is spirit, and so we're becoming God-like. I mean, it's not going to line up with the Apostles' Creed. But one of the things to understand about Hegel is he does not think that there is transcendent truth. Right? He doesn't think that there's like this body of universal truth that comes from God and that can be known sort of across the eras. And so he thinks that it's important to study the past to figure out what insights might have been discovered there that we don't see at the present moment. Secondly, he argued that we can and should learn from those we dislike, from those that we intellectually consider to be our enemies. So, wow, there's a novel moment, a novel thought at this moment. I'd like to call a half dozen radio talk show hosts and say, hey, read some Hegel. You could learn some things by listening to those people you disagree with. He believed that our intellectual enemies had pieces of the truth and that we should seek out what that was. For instance, he's against nationalism. Now again, he's for the French Revolution, which of course was a very nationalistic movement, but he was also against nationalism. So nationalism is, of course, a growing discussion today. So he said, look, part of what we learn by listening to people who are making nationalistic arguments is that we need an identity that is grounded in something bigger than ourselves. And we actually want to feel proud of where we've come from. And that we need something besides our own small achievements to be defined by. Third, Hegel argues in favor of institutions. Also a very trendy idea at the moment. He said that ideas need more going for them than just the fact that they're true. So ideas that are true need institutions behind them. They need employees. They need strategic plans. They need budgets. They need buildings in order to go and spread and to capture and to retain information and to build the systems that are going to see these true ideas be shared. They need more than simply to be true or to have somebody write a book about them. So again, I say this is trendy because one of the books I have on my desk is Yuval Levin's book, A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. The fourth thing that I'll note in the honorable mention category for Hegel is that he believed that art had a purpose. Art was not simply for art's sake. So Hegel sometimes gets associated with the German idealists. And the German idealists were similar to the Romantics. And remember, the Romantics were those people that were pushing back on sort of the cold, cerebral approach to just reason, to just Enlightenment reason. They wanted there to be more of the heart that gets involved. And so Hegel will say some of that. He will say that art, and I'm not just thinking about, fine art, I'm not just thinking about paintings, but music and architecture and poetry and all these things, they can help smuggle truth into us so that we are shaped by these things that are true. The final thing that I'll mention here, and actually not, the final thing that I'll briefly mention is that Hegel is noted as a thoughtful, analytical philosopher. But I don't think we want to talk much about analytical philosophy. So I'm going to move on to the biggest point about Hegel, and that is this idea of progress. So I mentioned a while back this idea of dialectical materialism. The term dialectic is the one that goes back to Hegel. So Marx will be the big dialectical materialist, and Marx will follow Hegel, but he'll actually stand Hegel on his head because Hegel's got this idea of spirit and ideals and the romance. Marx is going to be all economics, all material world, and so Marx is the one from which we get the term dialectical materialism, but Hegel is the one that gives us the term, at least popularizes the term of the dialectic, which he uses to describe the way progress happens, where there is movement from, you may have heard this, thesis to antithesis, and then synthesis. So you have an idea. R.C. Sproul, I was brushing up on my dialectic, and I watched an interview by R.C. Sproul, and R.C. Sproul says, okay, so you have Parmenides come by. Parmenides, the ancient Greek philosopher, and Parmenides says, all is being. This is very much in the kind of analytical philosophy and stuff that the metaphysical world that Hegel liked. So all is being. And then opposed to that, you have Heraclitus, and Heraclitus says, no, all is becoming. So you got one person saying A, you got another person saying not A. You've got this tension, you've got a stalemate, progress is stalled. Well, then you have to rely on, you have to wait for somebody else to come along, such as Plato. And Plato sort of looks at the thesis and then antithesis, and he synthesizes them together and comes up with his own understanding with two realms. And so now you have the synthesis, which then immediately becomes the next thesis. And on top of this, you're going to then have Aristotle standing against Plato, and you're going to have another stalemate. But over time, there will be a synthesis, and then that synthesis will become the next thesis, and then you're going to have the antithesis, and then you're going to have the next synthesis. So built into this whole way of thinking is this idea that history, society, progress lurches back and forth. Somebody makes a point, there's a movement, then there's the counter movement, and then there's a synthesis of those two things, and eventually you get something that hopefully is working, that is better. So baked into all this is the idea that there is going to be progress. There's going to be forward motion. So I selected Hegel as one of the 100 most, important people, events, or ideas to talk about because he sets up this idea of progress so well, and progress is going to become this big theme as we move into the 19th century. So we're going to see, as I mentioned, we're going to see Hegel as sort of one of the early influences in Marx. And Marx, of course, leading to socialism and communism. I mean, that is a huge driving, shaping ideology in the world today. So, as I said, Marx is going to put Hegel upside down. So, but he's going to use this idea. So Marx would say, you don't have a spiritual. Marx is not going to say that ideas shape the physical world. He's going to say that the physical world shapes ideas. Again, he turns Hegel upside down. But what you get with Marx is him saying, okay, we had feudalism, and then we had the opposite, we had capitalism. Okay, so we have these two ideas fighting against each other. What we need, where history is ultimately going to go, where we will finally arrive when we get it right. And Marx was arguing that there would be this definitive, this is the utopia, is socialism, right? So feudalism, the thesis, capitalism, the antithesis, the synthesis of these two is socialism. So we're going to see Hegel and Marx. We're also going to see Hegel in this idea of progress in a lot of other ways. So let me make 6 observations about progress. First of all, I think we would have to admit that progress is happening on many fronts. If we were to look down on the last couple hundred years from 30,000 feet, we would see lots of progress on lots of fronts. We have advances that are being driven by science and technology, which have fueled a lot of change. Our standard of living in the last 200 years has skyrocketed. So if you go back to John Deere, and since my dad worked at Deere for 37 years, and I have a sister that works at Deere and has for, 25 years, before John Deere comes along, before we sort of begin to mechanize the farm, something like, 92% of the people in the United States, in the West, spent their life on a farm or somehow in the production of food, right? I mean, we're all just trying to get by. You had a few other people besides those that were working on the farms. You had a school teacher and you had a pastor, and there might be a banker, and there might be somebody that's running a grocery store. But you don't have people, you don't have personal trainers, and you don't have website designers, and you don't have mechanics fixing cars or building cars. You don't have any of this stuff. Everybody's involved in trying to grow food. Well, today, less than 3% of the people are involved in, food production, growing food. Now, we got a lot of people that are in the pipeline between the food on the farm and getting it onto our table. But we've gained, 9 out of 10 people who now get to be involved in other things. And as they do other things, I mean, this is the whole capitalism thing, as we sort of specialize. And I work on my thing, and you work on your thing, and you get really good at making shoes, or you get really good at being a doctor, or you get really good at whatever, then I'm going to trade what I make for what you make, and the standard of living is going to climb. So we have seen progress fueled by science and technology and capitalism. It is undeniable that people, Americans in particular, of all income levels, are much wealthier today than they were just a few decades ago. The average amount of time that an unskilled American worker had to work in the 70s to buy a list of things, if you look at that same list of things, the amount of time that person needs to work today is 72% of what he was working before. So 30% of time has been won back. Put in another way, for the same amount of work that allowed a blue-collar American worker to purchase one item in 1979, he or she can buy 3.56 of those items today. If we compare the prices of 42 different items, so these are sort of the staples, grains, proteins, fruits, from the early 1900s to the prices that we find at Walmart today, and then factor in changes in wages over the same period for workers at the bottom of the income ladder. The calculation is that buying a basket of all these food items would have required 47 hours of unskilled work back then, and only 10 hours of that same work in 2019, a 79% decline. Put differently, an unskilled laborer saw his or her purchasing power double every 34 years. That's great. The number of American households with access to phones, cell phones, electricity, air conditioning, home appliances, TVs, computers, and other common household goods has dramatically climbed over time. According to Pew, for example, 97% of Americans now have a cell phone. 85% have a smartphone. 53% have a tablet. 77% have broadband. When you look at how these numbers are going up dramatically every decade, you see that we have seen a spike in our standard of living. It's also worth knowing while we're talking about this, that the pace of change, the pace of progress in one sense, progress in scare quotes here, the pace of progress has accelerated. It used to be that you learned your trade, whatever that was, from your father or your mother. They had learned the same trade from their father or their mother. You became a blacksmith and your last name was Smith because your dad was a blacksmith and your grandfather was a blacksmith and his grandfather before him, right? There wasn't a lot of changes. There were some technological advances every so often, but not that much. Well, today, the pace of change is dramatic. So whatever job you have, it's likely you have to remain engaged in ongoing education to stay current in your field. Even then, people change professions 3, 4, 5 times in their lifetime. And you go away for a 3-day weekend and you come back and you can feel like, oh my goodness, the world left me behind. So, first thing I'm saying is that progress is happening. Secondly, the pace of progress is accelerated. Third, progress is, the term is now used as a description of what is happening, an expectation of what should be happening and expected, and as an ism. So, I've already noted lots of advances rolling out every day. When we talk about progress, we're talking about what's happening. 2, since this has been happening throughout our lives, okay, since there has been progress going on, there have been advances going on, most people, at least most people in the West, assume that progress is going to continue. We assume that life expectancies will keep going up. We assume that our children will have a higher standard of living than we enjoy. We are not inclined to accept things remaining the same. I heard somebody complaining that air travel has not advanced in the last 25 years. And this is unacceptable, right? We're still flying at the same rate of speed that we were flying 30 years ago. That's not acceptable. So just staying where we're at is considered to be a bad thing. We assume that things are going to get better. They're going to be faster, cheaper, and more powerful. Your TV 5 years from now will be wall size. It will be micro thin. It will have 5,000 channels. It'll be in 3D, right? I mean, and if that isn't happening, then you want your money back. And by the way, we also, I said this is an ism, we also agree, most people, at least many people agree, progress is a good thing. Point number 4, progress is not a given. There have been times when societies have reset. They have lurched backwards. Progress can go cold. We can regress. So I read this little story. Nassim Nicholas Taleb has written a book describing what he calls the narrative fallacy. And it refers to the way that our minds can make cause and effects connections where they don't actually exist, and how we foolishly make predictions about the future based on patterns we have observed in our life. To illustrate this problem, he tells this story. Consider a turkey that is fed every day. Every single day, somebody comes by and feeds him. This will fuel the bird's belief that it is the general rule of life that he will be fed every day by friendly members of the human race, looking out for that turkey's best interest. On the afternoon of Wednesday before Thanksgiving, something unexpected is going to happen in the life of that turkey that is going to cause that turkey to need to revise their beliefs. I think Taleb's point is important. There is no guarantee that a consistent pattern from the past will continue uninterrupted into the future. People holding a progressive worldview, and please note, we're talking about progress, so about 5 years ago, as the term liberal was used in such a, both in a pejorative sense by some and in a confusing sense by others. I've already talked about the fact that there's at least 3 different ways the word liberal can be used, and some of them mean almost the opposite of the others. You started to hear not about liberals, you started to hear about progressives. And the belief is that progress is going to happen. We have to keep moving in order to stay on the right side of history. So tomorrow is always going to be better than today, unless, of course, you're a turkey and tomorrow is Thanksgiving. So I would say that the unstoppable progress of history is an illusion, a narrative fallacy, and that it's held by most of us. Few question the view that technology, human rights, economic growth, and democracy will expand and not contract in the future. The COVID-19 pandemic is a reminder, perhaps, that progress is not guaranteed. History includes many periods of decline and regression that we often ignore because they don't fit into our worldview. So, look, narrative fallacies are common also among religious believers. Using scripture or experience, we can deduce how God has acted in the past and then build a theological framework that insists he will always be acting in the same manner going forward. But this does not track with the idea that God is not only God, he is a person, and he can act in different ways than we might expect. So I want to say, when it comes to progress, look, I'm a fan of progress I'm a fan of so much of progress that has been happening in terms of economics and biomedical advances. The technology, I like so much of the progress in technology, but some of the progress in technology scares me. And it's not lost on me that we have not seen progress in human nature, right? So the belief is we're better and better every day. That's not true. So as a Christian, we would understand that every baby that is born sort of starts over, and that child is selfish. They've got a corrupted heart, right? Sin is spread throughout them, and they don't necessarily start smarter or better, kinder, more loving and gracious. And so we have a situation which we have. I mean, this is not new news, but we're building more and more powerful machines, bigger and bigger bombs, but we still have broken people. So I want to say progress is not necessarily a universal good. This is a point that gets made by conservatives. Thus, we sometimes can juxtapose these positions. William F. Buckley, remember in the lecture on Burke, William F. Buckley said that a conservative is someone who stands athwart history and yells, "Stop," right? Or at least slow down. We don't know what's coming. We don't understand the unintended consequences. And utopia is not guaranteed. We've got to think this through a little bit more. So if you disagree with this, like if you think progress is universally good, you have lots of company. But I think as we move through the 19th century into the 20th century, we're going to see the narrative at the end of the 19th century, and I'll read some of these things to you, but a lot of the elites there was so many promises that everything is going to be better and we're going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and everybody's good. It's sort of what Marx is saying. From each according to their ability to each according to their needs, we're going to reach this utopian world and everyone's going to just be free and it's all going to be wonderful. Or we're going to have a technological utopia and the computers are going to do all our work and we're going to be free to sit around, having picnics all day and let the robots do the machines. So you get all these promises of how much better things are going to be as we're coming through the 19th century, and the big name that sort of says you guys are idiots. That's not what's going to happen. Is Nietzsche, who we'll look at pretty quickly here. And Nietzsche is going to be also a German philosopher, and he's going to say, when the halo effect of Christianity, because God is dead, that's his famous line, God is dead. I think he says we killed him, but he says God is dead, and when the world moves away from this Judeo-Christian ethic, when it moves away from this idea that you need to love your enemies, and that you need to turn the other cheek, and that you need to be kind, and that you need to be generous, and that you need to care for the widows and orphans. When those ideas get pushed aside, he says, as they will, then you're going to discover, the world is going to discover, that the only thing that matters is power. And so that will be Nietzsche's big line. You want to be the Ubermensch, you want to be the Superman, you want to be the one that has the power so you can force your way. Well, there are other things that we might note about Hegel. It's interesting, I saw as I was preparing for this, a number of references to Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, which came out 20 years ago, and had some Hegelian overtones to it. So you might remember that book. He came out and he says, everything's, we've reached the end of history because Western liberal democracy, which is the cold, Russia's fallen, the Cold War is over, America is won, the Berlin Wall comes down. That's when he writes this, this book, The End of History. Well, we had the final synthesis. We've had this fight between Marxism and Western liberal democracy. Again, not liberal in the sense of progressive, liberal in the sense of the classic definition of liberalism. But he says, the final synthesis, you're never going to get better than Western liberal democracy, and democracy is going to carry the day and spread around the globe. Well, Francis, that didn't exactly happen. But you read about Hegel with that, and you read about Hegel in other settings. But I'm going to stop there. So let me say, no podcast next week. I am out over my skis. I have got some of the other parts of the day job I have got to attend to this week and get some of these other projects done. I'm also running a little outrunning my headlights a little bit on this. So no podcast next week. I have already started working on the next one, which is on Kierkegaard, existentialism. So yes, by God's grace, we will get to 100, just 1 week slower than we had hoped. I will see you in a couple weeks.